Anyway, thank you everyone for coming back, or if you're new, for joining us for the final panel of the Proxy Landscape Symposium. It's been a very good conversation so far, and I have no doubt that this last panel will continue the conversation. We're going to start. The format is slightly different this one because our next two guests, Jason and Emily Hammer, work together, and so they're going to be co-presenting, but they'll have the amount of time of kind of two. So if it feels like it's a kind of deeper dive, that's why. And then we'll hear from Geoff Manaugh, so bring us home. Great. So thank you so much for being here. Really looking forward to it. Great. Please, Geoff and Emily.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I want to apologize for how I sound. I feel about like how I sound right now, so I'm going to try to make it through this talk. I really appreciate the invitation from Bobby. I think when Bobby invited me to come down to Penn, I don't know that he realized he was inviting me back to my alma mater. I am Penn Anthropology, class of 1994, and I have spent the last 48 hours in shock at how the landscape that I thought I knew has evolved so dramatically. Really in just a few years. I think I was last here about 3 or 4 years ago. So I really appreciate the invitation, and especially a chance to connect with my collaborator, Emily Hammer. She and I are going to present to you 5 vivid case studies that we've been working on, sometimes collaboratively, sometimes independently, on how we have used historic remote sensing to tell us something about how people lived in the past. And so Bobby's challenge to talk about proxies really seemed like something that we were doing, but it was a chance for us to think maybe a little bit more deeply about it. So what we'll do, we're going to start out by giving a little introduction to what is archaeology. This is a very design-oriented audience, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some social science for you. And then how we're using proxies. We're using proxies in 2 different ways, and so I want to make that distinction. We're going to give you 2 recent case studies. Emily's going to tell you about the sad fate of the landscapes of the marsh Arabs in the 20th century. And then I'm going to tell you about the equally sad fate of Kurdish rural farming in the 20th century. How historic remote sensing allows us to capture landscapes that have, in this case, been destroyed by state action. Then we're going to turn to what we really do, which is think about the deeper past and going progressively back in time. I'm going to talk about hydraulic landscapes of the Assyrian Empire, and then an amazing landscape of movement associated with some of the earliest cities in the Middle East. And then finally, Emily's going to tell you about a particularly fascinating hunting landscape of the Neolithic, so even older. Okay, first, I'm an archaeologist. Emily is an archaeologist. This is probably a little basic, but we study the past from its material remains. I think this is important to note that if you really want to understand the past holistically, you have to use materiality. Writing has only existed really for about 4,000 years, and even after the invention of writing, it was used to advance the needs of the wealthy, of the elite, of the powerful. So you can't get a holistic view of the past without dealing with the things that we all leave behind, which is remains of our houses and our meals and even our bodies. So that especially applies to landscapes. If we take a kind of a very elite-centered view of landscapes, we will find that they all were created from the top down, and we know that that's not the case. So Emily and I do a specific kind of archaeology that we call landscape archaeology, and I'll get in a little bit to what that means. I think it'll feel familiar to a lot of you. Objects are obviously very important. The materiality of the past in the form of things like books, for example. It has various material properties. You can infer things about the past from this thing, such as levels of education, perhaps levels of wealth. But a single book in isolation doesn't really tell us anything. And I want to give you an example by a landscape phenomenon that I've become fascinated with, which is the little free library phenomenon. I noticed these first about 20 years ago popping up in my neighborhood, and every year there are more of them. I'm a runner, so I run around my neighborhood, and they're starting to pattern in interesting ways. So yes, they do tell us about literacy, as does an isolated object, but a small collection of these objects in their spatial context tells us something. It tells us something more. In this case, I can tell you that the spatial patterning suggests that this is something that's done by wealthy people, but really probably trending in a direction of wealthy progressive people, because this is an FU to the capitalist market economy. I'm not taking your money. We're going to have an exchange. Also, the pride colors here suggest also kind of some progressive tendencies. So distributing these across a landscape, I think we can understand a little bit about literacy, maybe some political leanings, and then we can compare the distribution of little free libraries to big monstrosities like Van Pelt Library, which is feet away from us. A very different spatial distribution. Again, a collection of books, but with an entirely different landscape context that is meaningful. So later on, Emily's going to tell me if this analogy worked or not, because I cooked it up on a plane 24 hours ago. But I wanted to talk about little free libraries. Okay, but more importantly to our purposes, if we're going to understand spatial phenomena at a regional scale, it very often helps to be able to pull back. And that's why remote sensing is especially powerful for landscape archaeology. You all know this place. This is Stonehenge, and everybody knows these monuments here. But step back from just these monuments and look at there's a ditch feature, there's a ring feature around it. And the further away you go from Stonehenge, the more of these very faint features that you'll see. Now, you're not seeing stones. What you're seeing here you're seeing a proxy. You're seeing several proxies. You're seeing, in this case, vegetation is telling us something about what's under the ground. Where vegetation grows in a particularly lush manner, well, there's probably a ditch down there. There's something that's capturing moisture and making vegetation particularly successful there. In areas that are dry, you might have a buried stone feature. The soils are thinner, there's not as much moisture there, and the vegetation suffers as a result. So to use these sorts of proxies, I've turned to the sky. Emily and I have turned to the skies. We've also found that historic imagery is better than newer imagery. And so Bobby and Emily and I have converged upon the Cold War. Declassified spy satellite images from the first mission, which was called Corona and ran from 1960 until a month after my birthday in 1972. Its successor, which was called Hexagon. And then most recently, we've discovered that in a very sneaky manner, the film from the U2 mission was declassified with very little fanfare and absolutely no finding aids. And Emily and I have spent some time trying to figure out how to access that. So we'll give you some examples from all of this. So this imagery was not born to help archaeologists learn about past landscapes. It was designed to do this. You're looking at a lovely chunk of pristine Russian forest in June of 1961. And then 1 year later, you're looking at that same chunk, a little bit less pristine, but now with some white-colored disturbances that any proper analyst can tell you are site support areas, roads, multiple layers of fencing around it. This is a missile site. So this is what the Corona and the Hexagon and the U2 programs were designed to do, which is aid us in the Cold War. There was a terrible fear that there was a missile gap between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the goals of these programs was to help American negotiators deal with that in arms treaties. The Corona program revealed an incredible missile gap. It was a very real thing. It was incredibly in favor of the United States. So it's probably because of Corona and these other programs that we didn't have the huge ramp up of missile building that could have led to World War III. Although don't rule out anything yet. These are strange times. Some of this, Emily and I have had to procure manually. There is no download button for some of this stuff, including the U2. So we, for several years, made pilgrimages to College Park, Maryland, where the NARA 2 office is, where we had to make a representation of a representation of a landscape, and that's how we've been operating. Now, before I get into my case studies, plug here for Emily's exhibit at the Penn Museum, which is still running. If you find that you're in the area and you want to see a particularly vivid way that Emily has put these to work into her case studies, check out the exhibit. It's really, really nicely done. So I've been asked by colleagues, why are you wasting yourself on this boring, old, relatively low resolution black and white film? Why don't you use the cool high-tech stuff that you can see on Google? And the reason for that is that high-tech stuff from Google, that modern commercial imagery, is great, and it shows you can represent landscapes in color, but it also captures a highly degraded landscape, the landscape of the very late 20th and into the 21st centuries, when a lot of the very ephemeral features that we care about, that we want to study, have been removed by development, by intensified agriculture. This is an ancient city in Syria called Tel Brak. You can see the mounded area of it here in 1967, when it had subtle areas of discoloration that represents a flat town that was underneath the Acropolis. And then beyond that, these dark linear features that were ancient trackways. Well, now in 2004, you can see that a local farmer has begun to intensively irrigate the area of that lower town. Irrigation requires leveling, and probably most of that is now destroyed. And a new settlement has been built over these subtle features of these trackways. So we find that this historical imagery is incredibly powerful for our purposes. So thinking about proxies, I realized as trying to pull this together that we're doing two levels of proxies when we do our remote sensing based work. The first one comes around kind of understanding what we're seeing on either the film or in the digital numbers behind the pixels of our images. Things that have high numbers or are light, these are things that are illuminated. They're dry or they're bare of vegetation. On the flip side, if they're dark, that means that they're probably either in the shadows or they're wet, and wet and vegetation usually kind of go hand in hand. So these are what I would call first level proxies. They are pixels or film marks that are telling us about structures or settlements, tracks, and other sorts of features. That's the easy one. It's the second level proxy, that's where things get fun. And that's where we take the constellations of features that we think we're seeing through those first level proxies, and we pull them together and interpret them to say something about the social, political, or economic structures in the past that resulted in the formation of these complex constellations. Okay, so I think I'm speaking for Emily. Emily, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we archaeologists are generally trained to look as far into the past as we can. And sometimes when we're looking at landscapes, we're annoyed because there's all this stuff on the top, and that's really the most recent traces of human activity. But I've come to realize that, in fact, really these recent, besides landscapes being of intrinsic value, sometimes they have really powerful stories to tell, and we shouldn't mentally try to erase them. We should embrace them. And so Emily and I have two historical case studies from the 20th century that we'll start off with. Both of these are in Iraq, and both of these revolve around rural, relatively unempowered communities that fell afoul of the Ba'athist government of Saddam Hussein in the 1980s and 1990s. I'm going to start off by handing things over to Emily, who's going to tell you about the marsh Arabs of southern Iraq.
So in the process of these reconnaissance missions that U2, Corona, and Hexagon cameras were flying, the cameras captured what military science historian and Penn professor, a friend of mine, Susan Lindy, has called collateral data. In between these places of interest for Cold War military intelligence, the cameras generated high-resolution photos and photo series of historical, archaeological, and ethnographic sites and landscapes. The use of historical aerial and satellite images for the identification of ancient sites and landscape features has for several decades been a common methodology in landscape archaeology, but we, as Jason has just said, we far less use these images for ethnographic details. So these first two case studies that, as Jason has said, deal with genocide and ecocide in the north and south of Iraq, and I begin here in the south, where high-resolution archival photos are among the only proxies that we now have for landscapes, worlds, and lifeways that no longer exist. Image time series that we get from these Cold War era cameras are a particularly useful and powerful proxy because they document seasonal variability and decade-scale change in a very heterogeneous landscape. So they give us a multi-dimensional proxy rather than just a single snapshot before the marsh's destruction. The marshes of southern Iraq surround the lower reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers before they join together in the Shatt al-Arab and debouch into the Persian or Arabian Gulf. Historically, these marshes were the largest wetland system in Western Eurasia. The flat, depressed topography and seasonal flooding of the rivers caused the formation of the marshes. They expand in the summer as snow melt from up in Turkey and in Iran raise the water levels, and then they contract throughout the rest of the year. The size and health of these marshes declined through the latter half of the 20th century due to development and also political actions. From the 1960s onwards, there was a massive explosion of hydroelectric dams along the Tigris and Euphrates in Turkey and Syria and further north in Iraq. And this restricted water flow and reduced the volume of floodwaters that were needed to sustain the marshes and also to flush away toxins. The subsequent expansion of irrigation agriculture also increasingly polluted the remaining water that did reach Iraq and the marshes. The decision by Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein in 1991 to drain the marshes greatly accelerated the effects of these long-term processes. The engineering project to drain the marshes was accompanied by campaigns of mass arrests, executions, and disappearances, the burning of the reed forests, poisoning of marsh waters, and gravel dumping into marsh waters to permit the passage of military vehicles. Sunni Ba'athist motivations for draining the marshes have been debated and were necessarily intertwined. They include development, modernization, oil exploration, control of the Iranian border, retaliation against the Shia marsh populations for their support of Iranian-backed forces, and a March 1991 uprising. Regardless of the motivations, the end effects were the same. 90% of the marshes were gone by 2000, as you can see in this imagery series here, and the lifestyle of the Madan or marsh Arab people disappeared. Marsh dwellers relocated to cities. In the aftermath of the Second American Invasion in 2003, the haphazard removal of some drainage infrastructure resulted in the reflooding of parts of the former marshes, but this reflooding has not been a linear process, especially as there has been a series of drought years. The ecocide and genocide in the marshes was part of the justification for American invasion, and the actual rehabilitation has also been an imperialist project driven by US and European-based actors. There's a lot to say there, but I'll bracket that for now. Some experts conclude that the broader rehabilitation of the marshes will not be possible because not enough water reliably reaches southern Iraq anymore. And the volume of water, which is already polluted, is insufficient to flush out the salts and toxins that have accumulated in the soil. Oil extraction and agriculture now occurs in some former marsh areas, and it's highly unlikely the Iraqi government would close those operations and permit marsh rehabilitation. Former marsh residents have not returned in large numbers because of decades of social and environmental transformation and the uncertainty of marsh survival, as well as the lack of electricity and clean water. Many studies carried out by, this is also a visualization I should have shown before of some estimations of the population of the marshes through time and also their contraction over the period that I'm talking about. Many studies that have been carried out by scholars from different disciplines have previously employed time series of low or medium resolution multispectral satellite imagery, like those Landsat images that I showed you, to map and quantify regional changes in hydrology and environments from the 1960s to the present day. Qualitative versions of these methods, relying on visual inspection and applied to these high-resolution panchromatic images from Cold War-era cameras, can be proxies for lost settlement landscapes, communication networks, and life worlds. I have been to these marshes because I actually work currently in southern Iraq for parts of the year. This is a picture taken in February 2019, but as I said, there has not been large-scale return. These are just isolated families that are taking their water buffalo into this area. And this is a map of the extent of the Al-Hamar marshes and central marshes in the early 1960s. And most of this area is covered by high-resolution corona and hexagon imagery, and then various U-2 planes flew over this area and also produced images in the late 1950s. So you can see the outlines of some of those images that I'm working with in red here. We also, of course, know about we have some ethnographic snapshots earlier in time of what life in these marshes was like. And anthropologically, the two most significant accounts are those of Salim, written in the early 50s, but not published till later. And then he's not an anthropologist, but the British traveler, Wilfred Thesiger, also wrote a book on the marsh Arabs and produced many really stunning photographs. At the most basic level, the archival, aerial, and satellite imagery offers proxies for the spatial organization, land use patterns, travel networks, and landscapes of communities that were documented by these earlier ethnographers and travelers. The Iraqi marshes were ecologically and socially heterogeneous places with spatial and seasonal variation in water levels, land forms, transportation possibilities, food sources, productive activities, and other aspects of life. So visualization through historical imagery can play an important role in our appreciation of this complexity, helping to bring written descriptions, photos, and maps to life. In particular, the imagery shows the spatial and temporal variability of settlement forms that were tied to different local environments, economic pursuits, and lifeways within the marshes. So you can see one marsh village here and the reed structures that make up that village. This is a time of low water in January, but in times of high water, each one of these structures was its own island within the marsh waters. And you can see lots of different types of agriculture that were carried out. This is a style of flood recession agriculture going on around these small inhabited villages. There was also a cultivation of different types of cultivation of some raised areas associated with former watercourses through the marshes. And some of these are actually connected to animal enclosures that are located outside of the villages because these are some close-ups of these animal enclosures. And that's because the water buffalo that these people were herding are really large and dangerous creatures. So they're kept outside of the settlement. So this is more of these enclosures. And then a lot of the villages are really nucleated, but others just take a linear form, sometimes because they are located along the banks of major watercourses that run through the marsh. And other times they take a linear form because of horizontal stratigraphy, because people were moving their villages like to the side of where their previous village had been when they were moving seasonally through this area. And so they create like these kind of like highways eventually through the marsh of like higher land. And obviously higher land is like a form of landscape capital within these marshes because you need to locate your hut or your tent on a higher area where it won't be flooded for parts of the year. So this is what some of this the formation of this horizontal stratigraphy looks like. You have inhabited villages aside abandoned ones. And then often, if you look at time series, you will see that they flip back and forth, inhabiting different areas or even shifting further along these radial boat paths that you see passing in and out of these villages because they're only accessible by boat for parts of the year. So these are just some, I'm not going to look at these, but you can see through in detail, but you can see the history of some of these villages through time by looking at these time series of images, how some of them got flooded, or in this case over here, there are dikes and dams that eventually drain parts of the marshes that cover over this village. You can see the growth and contraction of population through time. And eventually we can build out from that to to build a regional picture of settlement and demography, and to develop a better population estimate, because actually the population estimates vary by several 100,000 of who was living here in the 60s to the 90s. And so we're working to do that. And also to get a better picture of the interconnections between these villages by looking at the patterns of these radial boat paths. And so these are just, I threw these up as an example of some of the, the demographic and studies of connection that we're trying to do. We're also looking at patterns of settlement abandonment before the marshes began to drain, because there is this pattern of abandonment that's tied to larger social and economic processes before the major environmental change. So with that, I think I will hand this over to Jason for our second study concerning another genocide perpetuated by Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist regime in the northern part of Iraq against the Kurdish population.
Thanks. Yeah, so Emily mentioned that part of the draining of the marshes was related to the perception that the Marsh Arabs had been on the side of the Iranians in the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. So it was a punitive kind of retaliatory action there. That is unquestionably the reason why the villages of rural Kurdistan were targeted in the 1980s. So it's another example of that same time. So I don't have, unfortunately, Wilfred Thiesager never visited Kurdistan to my knowledge, so I don't have the beautiful ground shots of what the villages of Kurdistan looked like from the ground in the 1980s. But I can tell you that this is a typical agricultural village. These are farmers who lived in nucleated villages where house compounds consisted of rooms around a courtyard. So they were very inward facing in the center and with the rooms around the side. So this is the village of Bir Malik. It's near Erbil, which is the capital of the Kurdistan region of Iraq, in 1980. And this is it 37 years later when my archaeological survey team visited. Completely abandoned, but really more than abandoned, destroyed. In fact, deliberately pushed down with bulldozers. This is a product of the actions of the Iraqi army in the spring of 1987, when the government, the Iraqi army came in to displace all of the rural villages that couldn't be controlled as well as urban Kurdish populations could be. So you can see here, this is what we see on a hexagon image from 1980, and correspondingly what you see today. For every one of these, I'm showing you this one in particularly vivid detail because we made a very high resolution ortho photo with a drone when we visited in 2017. But the entire plain was depopulated. We get a taste of this. So really, we have two data points right now. We have 1980 with a living village with an irrigation channel here, another irrigation channel here, probably some fields surrounding it. The dark color tells me that this is a place where animals are kept. That's almost certainly manure in there. The CIA knew what was going on. This is a declassified National Geospatial Intelligence Agency map from 1995 that names the villages and labels them all, every single one of them, as destroyed. So this is imagery that hasn't been declassified, but it's clear that intelligence analysts were aware of what's going on. Now, the case that I showed you with this previous village, Buriam Malik, is actually the exception, a living village and now today a ruin. Far more typical is this, a living village, again with square courtyard houses, relatively tightly packed next to each other. And then this is exactly that same scene today. It's to the same scale. It is the same physical piece of earth. So it's a village again. But I challenge you to show me any point of overlap between the built environment of this scene and the built environment of this scene. So this is what's happened in this rural area. The Kurdish regional government has been subsidizing people to come back to these villages. This is a very different story than what Emily has told you about in southern Iraq. But when they're coming back, they're not really coming back. This is not the same society. These were the houses of farmers. These are very different structures. So there's a house. It has a wall around it, but it's a central built space. And in a lot of cases, you see all this green. Those are yards. Those are lawns. These are now the houses of maybe second or third generation displaced people who may or may not have lived in these villages, who are now coming out and they're treating this as their summer houses. These are not rural farmers. So I would argue that every bit as much as what Emily described for the marshes, a destroyed way of life, is actually also true of these Kurdish villagers. When I'm there today, I'm not around traditional subsistence farmers. So it's the genocidal actions in Kurdistan were just as effective as the ones in the south of Iraq. So I'm drawing heavily off of the senior thesis of my student Shane Rice, who's mapped these across the Erbil Plain, not quite yet to the amazing detail that Emily has done with the Marsh Arabs, but it is a similar tragic tale that at this point can only be told through the proxy of these declassified spy satellite images. These lifestyles don't exist anymore. Okay, on that cheery note, allow me to transition into 3 archaeological case studies. We're now going to go progressively further back in time and look at how these images, what they can tell us. I'm going to go pretty quickly here. First, I want to go back to 3000 BC and look at the landscape of the Assyrian Empire. This is actually not very far from these Kurdish areas that I was just showing you. Around 3,000 years ago, the Assyrian Empire controlled most of Syria, most of Iraq, parts of Israel, Palestine, into Iran and into Turkey, and was based out of this northern part of Iraq, which includes the Erbil Plain right there, where we just were. Most of what we know about the empire comes from excavations by archaeologists at the various political capitals that you see here with the triangles, ending with Nineveh, the final capital of the Assyrian Empire, this man, King Sennacherib, who built that one. This is a very, very top-down image of the empire. It comes from excavations only at the political capitals, and there's a whole lot of blank space in between, and that's where landscape archaeologists like me get a little twitchy, because surely other things must have been going on. Yeah, and in fact, when we look at these declassified images, we find lots of things going on in there. And especially we see very, very large interventions that suggest that maybe a lot of that propaganda that the Assyrian kings left us in cuneiform writings might not have been that far off. I want you to look here. You'll see that there's a naturally flowing river here. There's another here. But what I really want you to notice is this very large gouge running between the two of them, especially ending in what appears to be a basin right here. That's a 1 kilometer scale there that you see there. This is the contents of one river being moved into a basin and then spilling out into another. Now, even with that scale bar, it's hard to get a sense of the actual scale of this. So I flew a drone over this thing in 2017. That is a vehicle, and that is Khalil, who is our project drone pilot. Now, this is a 3,000-year-old very, very large cross-watershed earthwork. This is a time when there were no steam engines. This is manpower and animal power only. This represents a tremendous, tremendous output of labor, which can only be done with a tremendous amount of political control. So here I would say, while we can see very easily the first order proxy of dark equals canal, the second order proxies of these canals together represent an unbelievable intervention in the natural hydrology of Assyria. And in fact, all of the lighter colored lines you see here are areas that were either canals or canalized by the Assyrian kings. And it represents a complete transformation of the natural hydrology, something that would have required a tremendous amount of manpower and by extent, political power, something that we would associate with empires. I next want to jump about 1,500 years earlier in time, again in a very similar environment, to look at a different, also monumental landscape, but I would argue without the top-down aspects. We're going to look at some ancient trackways that are associated with some of the earliest cities that predated Assyria by a millennia and a half. They're very hard to see, sometimes when it rains, but mostly they look like this. This is a kind of today, this is an agricultural desert. If you squint, you might notice that this figure is standing in a very, very slight depression. In the background is a hill which represents an ancient settlement that's made out of mud brick and has melted back into the mud from which it came. This is looking along one of these holloway trackways. They're a little bit easier to see from the side, especially when they are beginning to collect moisture. That's that sort of water proxy. But it's not profitable really to understand these from the ground. You need to take a step up into the sky, and that's where intelligence imagery comes into play. So that image that I just showed you there was taken of a person standing in this line right here. If you follow this, it goes right up to what is almost certainly the gate into a very large city of the early Bronze Age. So individually, these aren't nearly as interesting as when you take them as a whole, as a constellation of features. So we're back to that city called Tel Brak that I mentioned before. Now you'll notice those trackways, those dark trackways, are radiating out in every direction, and that's the pattern that we see here: an unbelievable radiating trackway landscape of movement from 4,500 years ago. Now, this was a very large city, but it is not the only place that this happened. So here you're looking at a relatively, what would have been a village of maybe 200 people. It has the same radiating system around it. In this case, it's begun to capture the natural hydrology, and it's begun to act like a waterway. So when these are traced out and mapped, you can see an unbelievable network of connectivity almost 5 millennia ago between relatively large sites, small villages. It's a combination of tracks that go nowhere. They just go out and they end, and others that go through and connect with other places. These are almost certainly trackways that led to fields and to pasture. Once you got to the edges of the fields or pasture, you were no longer constrained onto this trackway, and you could disperse, and others went to neighboring villages. For my dissertation, I mapped 6,200 kilometers of these features. That is an unbelievably well-preserved landscape as of the 1960s of pre-modern movement. But this is not something that you should confuse with, say, the Eisenhower, the Eisenhower interstate highway system. If that were the case, there would be one awesome road that went between these two big cities. This is a landscape of people moving from town to town to town. It doesn't seem to be a political authority large enough to violate traditional landscape, land tenure practices. So I would argue that this is an emergent landscape. Unlike the Assyrian landscape that was imposed by powerful kings, this one's even more monumental, but it came from the bottom up, according to local agriculture and land tenure systems. Okay, so let's continue back in time to what is the most monumental of all of these systems, Emily's next case study.
Thanks. So this one is this last case study is a little different in terms of the like first order proxies, to use the terms that Jason was using. The first order proxies are actually, so they are for stone walls, but you're actually, in many cases, not actually seeing the stone walls themselves, but the cleared earth spaces next to them, from which the stones have been removed in order to create those walls. So the major feature or proxy of this last case study are features called desert kites. So you can see this desert kite here. I'll show you a diagram of one in a second. They are mass kill hunting traps that are found across the panhandle of Jordan in the basaltic desert that's known as the Hara. And they were used from late Neolithic times, probably until the early Bronze Age, for the mass kill of gazelle. So here's a diagram of one. What happens with these things is that this is obviously the trap part of the trap. It's called the head, and it often takes crazy forms like a jellyfish or a star or a diamond. Sometimes it's somewhat circular like this. And it's usually positioned topographically, so it can't be seen. All right, so the animal finds itself suddenly surrounded. And then it has these long tails, which is then the genesis of the name desert kite. This is what they were called by the Royal Air Force pilots that noticed them when they were flying mail routes between Baghdad and Amman in Jordan in the 1920s. So what happens is that gazelle are herded by hunters along the lines of these traps into the head, where they suddenly find themselves trapped. And sometimes there are blinds within these heads in which hunters would have hid in order to kill the animals. You can see some drone photographs here, what these things look like on the ground. So a lot of times what we're seeing so these are black basalt walls, but a lot of times the main proxy that we see in the historical aerial and satellite photographs are these bare areas of earth because there are basalt stones everywhere in this landscape. You'll notice that these walls are quite low. They're sometimes only like this off the ground. And so you might think, okay, well, that because maybe they fell down like over the millennia or something. But actually we have a lot of good evidence that they were never much higher than this. And this is actually like, I guess you could think of it as kind of like a proxy for the like psychology of gazelles and other like herd ungulates. It's been found in modern zoological studies that actually gazelle, when their movement is being forced, that they follow a straight line on the ground much more effectively than they would even if there is like a large like visual barrier. So this is like using the psychology of the gazelle and basically to like force them to run along these lines. It's not actually a wall; it's just a line that they're running along that they end up then in this track. And so the position of these hunting traps, which are thousands of them are found across northern Arabia, is a proxy for animal migration in a way that I'll talk about in a minute, and also human subsistence at a time of a very different environment. It was much wetter in this area in the late Neolithic because of the convergence of European orienting and also south like Indian Ocean oriented weather systems brought a lot of rain to this area that it doesn't come here today. So I think these images are very beautiful. So I'll show you what a couple of these kites look like. They are not also not isolated in the desert. There are lots of other features that surround them that we don't entirely know how to interpret. There's a lot of archaeologists working on this problem. So you can see one kite here and another kite here. They are often found interconnected with one another. Here is a very complicated set that has lots of different trap heads. And we used a couple hundred, actually, many more than what are on this slide, U-2 spy plane photos to document these across this eastern panhandle of Jordan. These kites actually extend up into southern Syria and into what's now northern Saudi Arabia. You can see here the pattern of the kites in green, and they often form these long, like interconnected chains. So basically, I mentioned before that these are probably a proxy also for animal migration. It's likely based on paleoenvironmental reconstructions and what we know about the biology of what are now extinct gazelle species, that they were migrating between what's now northern Arabia and up into Syria. And so they would have passed through this region. And we think that these chains of kites are then for like capturing these herds of migrating gazelle, especially as they approached water sources that would have been in the area in the past. So we can't, on a regional scale, very easily map where water would have occurred in the past, but we can use some modern data as like a proxy of where water would have been in the past by looking at where it pools when there are massive rain events in the desert. It's to look where those surface pools are, but then also using a near surface temperature this is a MODIS image, for example, to look at where groundwater, because when groundwater pools, you also temporarily after a rainstorm have a cooler surface temperature. And so we're using that to look at the relationship of these desert kites to the environment to better understand how they are a proxy of, of animal movement and human subsistence practices. So that brings us then to the end, which I don't know that we have like mapped out too well.
Yeah, stick around because in terms of concluding thoughts, I want to conclude that this was fun. I loved seeing Emily's case studies next to my own, and especially how they're connected. Collateral data.
Yes, so this is a good picture for collateral data. So you see here in this image both what Cold War photographers and military intelligence specialists were actually after. They were photographing these like small airfields in the Middle East. That's why they were on these missions. But then you see also to the, further up from there, you see the modern city of Hama that still exists today, and the massive archaeological site that goes back thousands of years that's located in the center. So you can see how we get what the things that Jason and I are primarily interested in is collateral to what they were actually after.
Yeah. Okay. I think what I would say in terms of concluding thoughts is this has been an interesting prompt to think about archaeological epistemology. We cannot access the past directly. Everything that ever happened in the past, it can only be accessed through what survives of it, but that exists in the present. And you've heard the expression that history is written in the present. That is very, very true. So we can only get to the past through proxies. But I see a couple of different ways that we're using proxies here. In our remote sensing work, we're like literally interpreting the signatures of things on imagery to represent features on the ground. And what makes this collateral data so fantastic is its large area and it's early, and it allows us to come up with staggeringly large data sets. And in the size of those data sets allow us to say things that we couldn't say if we just had, say, one feature on the ground. So it's that second order, that second level of proxy that I think really allows us to say meaningful things about how people lived in the past and what sort of social structures produced this. The other thing I wanted to say, pulling these things together, and this came to me last night, it seems that when I think of impacts on landscapes, we assume that it's going to be states and empires that have the ability to mobilize labor. They're the ones that are going to make the biggest impact. But thinking about these holloway systems of 6,000 kilometers surviving, and how many hundreds or thousands of square kilometers of desert kites. It's actually, in terms of cumulative labor hours, it's probably these emergent landscapes that are much larger. Empires are big and flashy; they make these big canals, but it's the durable impacts of humans operating independently over millennia, perhaps, that really leave the mark that we're seeing here. Anything else?
I guess, yeah, also that we see these proxies best in certain landscapes that haven't been transformed by modern land use, of course, which is why you see these ephemeral features preserved out in eastern Jordan. And I guess that would lead me to say that there's this one other way in which we are using the proxies in these images, which is to understand how the record of the deeper past has been transformed by more recent land use. And it also helps us to understand some industrial forms of land use that we don't understand so well. We get a better picture of that by looking at these images and understanding what it looked like, and also how it changed through time, because this imagery series covers several decades. Thanks.
That's a good point. Yeah, Bobby, when the symposium comes around to you, let me throw out palimpsest as your next one. Yeah, unless it's been done to death. Okay, thank you, everyone.
See if it works this time. All right, cool. Well, thanks everyone for sticking around, and also for the initial invitation, Bobby, and congrats on putting together a great event. It's been very stimulating, both the event itself and the dinner last night and the lunch, and just kind of the subsidiary conversations that have been popping up. And it's an honor to be here and to be here with all my fellow panelists. So thank you. Yeah, it's a bit daunting to follow Jason and Emily in the sense that one, that was a great presentation, but then also I'm working on a book on geophysics and remote sensing and archaeology. And this is a sort of a test run, I guess, to see if I'm a journalist and writer, so it's a good test run to see if archaeologists think I'm full of BS or not. But what I'm going to do is kind of present two lines of research, both of which involve hidden things revealing themselves through the surface of the earth. The first bit will be mostly geological with a little bit of architecture, and then the second half will be a focus on geophysics and archaeology. So what I wanted to start out with was actually a project that I got involved with many years ago for curating an exhibition that was looking at landscape design and where high-tech interventions in the design of landscape. I found myself being increasingly uninterested in cataloging specific acts of landscape architecture. This is not a judgment on landscape architecture. It was just that the way that the exhibition itself was moving. I became really captivated with instead this intermediary moment of measurement or of prospecting or of surveying, and of these kind of quasi-romantic with an uppercase R scenes of lone individuals surrounded by spectacular landscapes holding on to strange machines. What are they doing with these instruments and these devices, and what do these devices allow us to see around us, and to what extent is seeing just a metaphor? This is a kind of prototypical, a prototype of LiDAR, and it's for measuring the peaks of mountains. Many of these scenes are from the US Geological Survey. This too is a man that looks like he could be Claude Monet setting up a painting studio in the wild, but in fact is doing, again, landscape measurement and metronomy. Or this scene that matches, or rather resonates with some of the images we've seen over the last 2 days, or the last 24 hours, of a person who is doing an acoustic study of a frozen lake in New England. But it could just as well be, someone listening to fish or recording an ambient album. Or this device, one of my personal favorites, not least because of the name. It's called a creep meter. So it measures creep. Creep, as I will return to in a few slides, is the very, very slow deformation of the Earth's surface. and of a landscape that is being deformed from within, but on a scale that is invisible to the human eye. And so a creep meter indicates very, very small millimetric or centimetric changes in the landscape, and allows us to see that things are moving without earthquakes or without any kind of a sudden jolt. It's a very slow, molasses-like movement. Again, I'll come back to that. Or in my own research for the book I'm writing, scenes such as this. This is French geophysicist Michel Debat, who's using a prototype device. It's the 5th generation of an electrical emitting electrode system, where if you look towards the individual near the camera here, who's Michel, the electrodes that are attached to this TARP system are putting lobes of electricity into the ground. And that electricity is then being recorded and measured by the electrodes on the back end of it. And then the entire thing is being laser tracked by the prism in the center. And what we were doing is we were actually, the main use of a lot of this technology is for non-invasive archaeology, or archaeology that does not require excavation. And so what we were actually doing was searching for, discovering, measuring, and then imaging a church that was beneath this church, without, of course, digging through the flagstones or causing any physical harm to the cathedral itself. This is just another scene of this kind of strange sci-fi-like magic carpet that is able to find architecture within architecture, or structure within the earth, anthropogenic structure. But so as I was looking more and more into these instruments and these devices, it was increasingly interesting to me, well, what constitutes an instrument? What constitutes a device, and how large scale can these be? What is the scale at which they reveal things about the planet around us? Is it only just measuring mountain peaks, or looking for churches beneath cathedrals? And eventually that led to a project that I don't have time to get into particularly, but this is a tool known as GPS Geodesy. So everyone here is familiar with GPS, the global positioning system. It allows Google Maps to track you, et cetera. It's how cars know where to drive. But geologists realized that if you attach a GPS unit deep enough to bedrock so that the GPS unit itself remains stationary, and then if you track it by satellite over time, over many years, over a decade, over multiple decades, the movement of that tripod itself, which is what you're looking at, it's a GPS unit drilled down to stationary bedrock, will move enough to be tracked. So that doesn't sound like too much, and it might just sound like, well, we already know that the Earth's plates are moving. It's all part of plate tectonics. Sudden movements cause major earthquakes. But what was realized was that, in fact, the surface of the Earth is moving around like taffy. It's constantly moving, and it's moving in directions that we didn't anticipate. And in fact, we can see plate tectonics happening in real time. This is a map that I like to show because if you look at the arrows, which are obviously not... that is not the real distance that those have moved. That would be several, that'd be 100 miles at a clip. But the larger the arrow, the larger the movement. You're looking at really kind of millimeters to potential centimeters of motion. But this is a map of the western United States. And you can begin to see, if you look closely, that there are these sort of vortices of movement. There are these currents and tides that are happening within solid Earth. And I feel like one of the things that is interesting to take away from this is that by heavily instrumenting the planet that we assume to be solid, we reveal a kind of oceanographic aspect to the terrestrial. When we're studying solid ground, we are in fact performing an almost bathymetric survey. It's more like looking into a very slow liquid as opposed to a very stationary solid. And those kinds of realizations come through instrumentation. They're either the realm of poetry, where we talk about how the ground we stand on is not stable, that the world is shifting beneath our feet, or it's this world of scientific surveys and instrumented study. But again, what is an instrument? What is a device? What can they look like? Is there anything that we could use as an instrument or as a device that isn't in fact electromagnetic or requires electricity or satellites? I was interested to go to a town called Hollister. It's in California. It's just sort of southeast of San Francisco. There's no offense to Hollister, there's no particular reason to visit Hollister other than the fact that it's a place famous amongst geologists for experiencing a phenomenon known as fault creep. So here we are back to creep. So it turns out the entire city of Hollister, the town of Hollister, is a creep meter. It's an inadvertent one, and it wasn't built to do this, but nevertheless, it's right on something called the Calaveras Fault. It's a subsidiary fault of the big San Andreas system that goes up the spine of California. But the geological circumstances of that part of the fault are that the minerals down where the Calaveras Fault runs are very soft. It's more like talc than it is like granite. Which means that it's drifting more like a marshmallow than it is like two bricks that are colliding into one another. So when you have a large earthquake, it's because two things are locked together and they suddenly break. But when you have fault creep, you just have this, it's almost like two people pushing pillows in opposite directions, where it's all just, it's a mush that moves in a more or less continuous way. So this house, believe it or not, is more or less directly on top of the Calaveras Fault. And so if you're noticing a slightly oblong, a cube becoming a rhomboid, say, a geometric transformation in the house itself, it's because it is in fact changing. The left side of this image is moving north, which is basically exactly into the image. It's perpendicular to the image. So the house itself becomes an inadvertent creep meter. And you begin to notice this throughout the town. Curbs such as this are torqued out of alignment, and it's not because of a drunken city planning crew or complicated property lines. It's because you can actually follow a line of deformation that goes through the entire city of Hollister. Here's another example where the curbs have broken. And this is where you get into maybe a novelistic approach to how you might find these sorts of data points. But it's a city where there are a lot of home repair bills. Windows and doors frequently can't close, even though they were only constructed 3 or 4 years earlier. There are a lot of water main breaks. You'll see a lot of traffic lines are continuously being repainted because they're being bent out of shape or breaking apart. A particularly interesting example that I enjoyed for the kind of the postmodern comedy of it was that there's a park in the middle of town, and as the left side of town is moving north, so the west side of town is moving north, it's forming a berm throughout that is rising in the middle of this park. But I think most locals are unaware of the phenomenon that is transforming their city from below. And this is, instead of becoming a kind of geological source of wonder, the berm in this park is a very popular place to sunbathe. It's perfectly sort of torqued up or leaned up so that you can watch the sun go down. And you'll often find human bodies kind of aligned along this area. Unbeknownst to them, they're enjoying the benefits of plate tectonics. I could go on in great detail about these things. Unfortunately, I won't be able to do so. And I'm going to leap into the archaeological part of my talk. So we saw a little bit of this already with Jason and Emily, but these are crop marks. Jason had an excellent diagram that showed the phenomenon that makes these appear. So when you have a rocky feature, such as the abandoned wall of a house or the ruined foundation of a villa, the vegetation atop that will grow less high than the vegetation around it because the roots are shallower and the soils are depleted. However, if you have a ditch, then the vegetation will be more luxuriant and taller. Most of the realizations of this came from a kind of local farmer knowledge of their own fields, where someone would notice that there were just strange features in a field. There were maybe linear features that they might see when they were plowing or sowing. But it really kind of came into its heyday after World War I, when enough private wealth intersected with the growing aviation industry. And land-owning pilots would take their own little jets up, and they would fly around and look down and start taking photographs, such as this, these are photographs by George W.G. Allen, who it's important to point out was also a military was in the military. And so there's a very interesting historian named Kitty Hauser who has a great book that looks at the history of aerial archaeology and how these images were first noticed and how you're effectively taking images of images. You're getting an image of buried architecture appearing in the field, and then you're taking an image of that image as it emerges. But what's so fascinating about this is that they're very temporary. You could fly your plane over this field and 6 months later, and you wouldn't see this feature at all. It might be because a farmer has harvested the crop that is growing there, or it might be because the conditions of drought or of rainfall have changed. It may even be because of the time of day. The other thing that happens is that if you have a slight disturbance in the ground, it's more visible at sunrise and sunset because it will start casting a shadow, which led to the name shadow sites. And so these shadow sites became, are sort of epidemic around places like England, where these photographs were taken, I should have clarified. Where you're seeing the reappearance of Roman and even pre-Roman archaeological features in fields. But so again, the question of what is an instrument now becomes a look at the vegetation itself. As Kitty Hauser points out, things like barley can become sort of an archaeological instrument. The way it grows, it's particularly sensitive to changes in the soil, and it's also particularly sensitive to its own growth variations in height. And so it's an unusually useful plant if you're trying to reveal the presence of something in the ground below. She writes, field archaeologists know that vegetation grows differently on soil that has been disturbed, even if that disturbance happened centuries ago. They know that crops grow more luxuriantly over silted up ditches and more stunted where there are buried remains. The site of a Roman villa might go unnoticed until a field of wheat grows and ripens to reveal most strangely the outlines of buried masonry, only to disappear again at harvest. Slight contours or indentations on the land, marking out the site of a lost settlement, might be invisible to the eye until a low sun throws them into sharp but momentary relief. But I mentioned that it was a military pilot who was taking these photographs, and this touches on some of the themes that the other presenters have mentioned, and that we saw, of course, directly in Emily and Jason's talk. But there was a really fascinating overlap between military surveillance flights and archaeologists during World War I, where there was basically a back and forth between people who were trained in the archaeological interpretation of imagery and people who were trained in looking at aerial photographs to deduce where, say, an enemy army had built trenches or was fortifying a river position. If you could take those photographs and give them back to someone to interpret, who would you give it to? Well, an archaeologist would be a great person to look up. And so this kind of back and forth between archaeological interpretation and military interpretation really helped shape a lot of the early archaeological use of these kinds of images, and has continued through the work of people like Jason and Emily. Of course, these are famous images that they go viral on the internet more or less every 2 years. Whenever there's a drought in Europe, there's an article in the BBC or the Guardian or the New York Times or architecture blogs, that talk about the reappearance of ghost buildings in the fields of stately British manor houses or homes throughout Western Europe, where architecture begins to bleed through the ground. I particularly like these. These are photos, aerial photos by a French archaeological investigator named Jacques Dacier, who was photographing these fields in southern France, where old Roman villas are becoming visible as the crops grow. If you had told me that this was an AI-generated image or that this was just sort of a fairy tale, I would have believed you many years ago. But these are the kinds of features that appear. I wanted to talk really briefly about persistence. These things seem very ephemeral, and it would seem that archaeological traces, even though they stretch back thousands of years, are very, very vulnerable. But it's quite interesting, actually, what survives and just how much damage an archaeological site can take before it truly disappears. Going back to Kitty Hauser, she has a nice way of referring to this. But she writes that one of the most remarkable things about aerial archaeology is that very few human processes will completely remove a site from view forever. It might be decades, centuries even, before the right combination of crop growth, rain, sun, and aerial observer results in a site manifesting itself and being photographed. But unless deep excavations or quarrying are carried out, removing all traces of the site, the possibility remains that one day, under new conditions, it will reveal itself. So I like this idea that there are things in the ground beneath us that are constantly threatening to reappear and to remind us of a past that we may not know about. This is a quote actually from Jacques Dacier that I just put onto the slide, where he writes, "Under cereals, which are the crops growing, the city reveals its streets and its districts of dwelling. It is a true radiography of the ground." You can see more and more of these kinds of buildings, stables, villages, settlements appearing depending on the crop. But so I wanted to throw this in because there's actually some quite interesting research into, I mentioned that barley, for example, might be a particularly good indicator species for finding archaeological ruins. But the reason why I'm showing this is that researchers have now found that you can use plants that seek out nitrogen to locate landmines or unexploded ordnance. Nitrogen, of course, is an explosive. You can use fertilizer for creating bombs. Timothy McVeigh, for example, attacked the federal building in Oklahoma City using fertilizer. That's one of the reasons why large fertilizer purchases are federally tracked. But so fertilizer and nitrogen, when it's in the ground, is also, it's very good for plants and plant roots. And so if you can develop, in this case, it's thale cress. It's a kind of an herb. But if you grow this plant in certain conflict zones, they may reveal the presence of landmines or of explosives that you don't want to step on. But of course, if you put this in an archaeological context, one of the ways, for example, that old Viking settlements are being found in Greenland is because the nitrogen content of the soil is higher than would be expected if it was purely quote unquote natural. But so the trace, the quote archaeological trace in this case is not architecture. It's simply through human remains, organic remains, animal bodies, human bodies, leaving nitrogen in the soil. But it seems interesting to speculate that it may be possible to develop plants that specifically seek out archaeological ruins, or would at the very least be more relevant in the pursuit of archaeological sites. I'll use this briefly as an example. I was in the field in western Italy, central Italy, several years ago when an historian pointed out that a colleague of his had actually started, it was having a notable success rate, locating Etruscan tombs based on weeds that were growing in fields, that the Etruscan tombs would be weeds and plants that had shorter root needs would be growing atop the tombs, whereas as you went around them, you would find weeds that had deeper purchase in the ground. And so it was actually the absence of certain plants would indicate where to dig or where to search with a GPR, ground penetrating radar, for an Etruscan tomb. So there seems like a potential promise for this. So speaking of ground penetrating radar, I've been going out in the field and meeting archaeologists and geophysicists. This is a great indication, I think, of where archaeology is going. This is an autonomous ground vehicle that was designed by an agricultural robotics firm. The idea is that it will actually should have a plow attached to it, or it's potentially for weed mitigation. But instead, they have put $250,000 worth of ground penetrating radar gear on it, and this thing can drive around. And the vision is that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, a fleet of archaeological robots will be driving through fields all over the world using ground penetrating radar to find ruins, and in this case, Viking settlements. This is in Norway. This is an example from just outside Vienna. It's a Roman military garrison known as Carnuntum. 99% of that city is unexcavated, and yet 100% of it has been mapped using ground penetrating radar and magnetometry. So this is a photograph I took of a screen that shows very visible architectural features in relatively high resolution, but are nevertheless completely invisible on the Earth's surface. When you're walking through a quote-unquote empty meadow, unbeknownst to you, you may in fact be in the midst of a city. It's an invisible city that is beneath you, and it is physically real. It's historically real. It is forensically real, but it is visually inaccessible to you unless you use the correct machines to find it. This is a magnetometric scan. I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna jump briefly to Ohio. There are some great examples that I think touch on some themes we've mentioned over the last 24 hours. This is an individual named Jared Burks. He's an archaeologist. He's also a specialist in geophysics, including magnetometry. The device he's holding is in fact a magnetometer. Those black rods go into the PVC rods of that gate-like thing. The gate-like object is then pushed forward through a field. This is an example of it at work. We're in the middle of a cow pasture in sort of south central Ohio. If you happen to be an NFL fan, this is right outside the town that Joe Burrow, the quarterback of the Cincinnati Bengals, is from. No offense if you're not, this is academia. But Ohio turns out to have one of the highest number of indigenous earthworks in the entire United States, despite the fact that it has no federally recognized Native American tribes. During the European genocide of the native population of the US, basically all major tribes in Ohio were forced into reservations in Oklahoma. But so when you're looking at an empty field, people like Jared Burks see things like this. These are magnetically real architectural remains, and they're in the ground, and they are clearly visible when you see them through a device or a machine, and they can be mapped and measured. But of course, when you are walking over that ground, you would see nothing. When I say nothing, I don't literally mean nothing. I mean, you'd see grass and trees and your fellow hikers, but there would be no reason to necessarily know that you're walking over Native American landforms. So how does he know where to look? Sure, of course, if you have many millions of dollars, you could just scan the entirety of Ohio. But one thing that Jared's been doing is going back to the first publication by the Smithsonian Institution, which was a catalog of native landforms throughout the Ohio River Valley. And it is a catalog of similar to, in a sense, to the aerial photographs of the Corona program and Hexagon. They were the landforms that were there when they were mapped. So they were physically real. You could see them. They were mapped. They were drawn. They were sketched. They were hypothesized about. But I'd say the majority, if not the overwhelming majority of them, have now been destroyed or bulldozed. This is just a great example. The feature in the center, sort of to the right, is now a tourist site, but it's a series of mounds you can go to explore the Hopewell culture, as it's known. But if you look in this map published, or this book published by the Smithsonian Institution, you'll see that feature, but you'll also notice this large circle that's appearing. This Shriver Circle is now underneath a penitentiary. That's a carceral, or an example of carceral architecture here on the right. But Jared Burks and his colleagues, incredibly, got permission to actually go onto the grounds of the penitentiary with their magnetic device and actually perform a magnetic survey. And they were able to actually find successfully find magnetic traces left, even though they were going underneath concrete, even though they were in a heavily built up area. So these things, they persist. They're in the landscape. They are materially real, even if they are inaccessible to us as human sensing organisms. And there's actually something quite astonishing to me that things like a single campfire, if we were to go out into the woods and go camping this weekend, our fire could leave a trace in the ground that could last for thousands of years. And the individual human actions can actually leave archaeological traces. And there's something both interesting from an archaeological point of view and also somewhat exciting from a symbolic point of view. We leave longer traces than we believe. I'll do one more thing and then tie this off. So also Jared pointed out this fascinating realization that he had. Ohio is in the American Midwest. It's subject to large thunderstorms. These big plains and farmers' fields are often struck by lightning. He began to notice that lightning strikes appear in the magnetograms that result from doing magnetic surveys. And he also noticed this one detail that really kind of blew my mind, which was that because of the nature of these landforms, these native landforms that have been bulldozed over, you often have areas of heavily compacted clay. Heavily compacted clay is not only waterproof, but it also means that when rainfall comes, it might accumulate along the lines of the foundation walls of these or the edges rather of these landforms. Because there's more water that surrounds them, and because it's clay, you have a conductor. And he's noticed in several of the magnetic surveys that he's done that lightning can actually help illuminate landforms later in the surveys that he's doing. And again, there's something just kind of poetic and incredible about this idea of field archaeologists kind of collaborating with thunderstorms and lightning as they search for otherwise invisible indigenous remains. I'll skip all this. To end with, it's just a parable that I think is useful. A lot of people like to say, okay, if this is invisible and if we can't see it and we need high-tech devices, well, what's the use? I know my book editor asked me that question. But I like this parable. There was an otherwise irrelevant example, but there was a gentleman who was helping people get over the pain of phantom limb syndrome, which is that if you have lost a limb, you can still potentially feel you'll have ghost sensation as if you still have your right arm, or as if you still have a leg that you lost in injury, illness, or war. And he began traveling around rural Cambodia, where there were a lot of amputations due to war and landmines, and actually using this very simple tool. It's just a mirror. He's called here the Mirror Man. But by allowing people to see the illusion that a missing leg was still there or a missing arm was still there. They were able to psychologically adapt to something that had been lost by seeing an image of the thing that was gone. And I like to imagine that some of these geophysical surveys that archaeologists are participating in are almost like a society-wide mirror man or mirror person, I should say, who is showing us what we've lost, what it is that we may still have, a kind of burning sensation of a past that we don't understand or that we don't have an image of or that we can't see, and that the archaeologist as mirror person kind of shows up and allows us to sort of heal with a missing history and show us where we've come from. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Mel Bleeker. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us here today, and thank you, Bobby, for inviting such a lovely constellation of speakers. It's been a really enjoyable experience for me to be able to sit and be an active observer, thinking through kind of all of the nested and overlapping relationships in all the talks throughout the day. And so what struck me, Bobby, in your introduction and the opening acknowledgements was the uses of the different features of the landscape as operationalized for their function as proxies, how these distinct features can be used as agents of sense-making. And to me, that kind of thread seems to chart its way through all of your three talks today. And so I see in your work, Emily, this attention to reading the landscape through the product of lens-based media. And so I was curious, between your work and Jason, your statement on the primacy of the object in the research that you do. To you suggested that it's a primacy of the object over the graphic within architecture or archaeological investigations. And so how do you interpret the object as mediated through film or through image or through a graphic kind of representation in the U-2 spy planes that you were working with?
How do I interpret the object as mediated through the film? Well, I have to say, if I can scale up a little bit to features, because for the most part, my imagery can't resolve maybe the things that we would consider to be an object, but something like a building, like a monument, perhaps. Trying to understand that mediation is what I've been doing for my entire career. The Corona satellite was declassified when I was in my 4th year of graduate study, and it was put into my lap and by my advisor, who I think probably asked me that same question, and now 25 years later or whatever, I'm still thinking about it. So the talk that Emily and I gave, we showed very little of us on the ground. I was impressed to see that Emily has been into the marshes. That's the way we resolve this, is we have to get what's called ground control. Now, I can't get ground control on something that was imaged, in 6 years before I was born. So this can be really tricky in this case, and it leaves all of our interpretations potentially incorrect. But I think correct me if I'm wrong, Emily, I've gotten very, very comfortable with the possibility that I'm wrong about things. So it's a constant ongoing progress. I see something, I think I understand it from the image. I try my best to visit it on the ground. It may have been destroyed and disappeared long before I was born, because I'm looking at an image from the 50s or the 60s. I still do my best, and I wait for the next generation to tell me that I'm wrong. I suppose that's how I do it.
I appreciate that. Thank you for that answer. I suppose I was thinking through your kind of emphasis on the object through this idea of how kind of images are made and built and represented in this kind of like gradient from kind of print pixels is what I've read recently, and kind of with this like hyperarticulation of the digital image and how these technologies have become kind of increasingly specialized. Do you see that this kind of sorry, I lost my page here. That this kind of method of kind of viewing the landscape has changed your ability to see things in your day-to-day life? Is this kind of attuned focus to reading images change the way that you operate in the world?
I think the answer is yes. I very often see things and wish I could adjust the contrast on this thing that exists in real life, and I know how to do that in Photoshop and in my software. And unfortunately, Google hasn't created the glasses that allow me to do that in real time just yet. This has made me sensitive to things that I'm used to seeing from space on the ground. Actually, the afternoon that Harvard's encampment was cleared out of the yard, I passed through just getting back to my office, and there were these discolored squares where there had been tents, and I realized, oh, this is what I would recognize this from space. Why did it take me? Why did I have to kind of pause and think for a minute at interpreting that on the ground? I would turn this to Emily. Does this happen to you?
Sure, yeah. Like when I'm on a plane or whatever, I'm always, looking out the window, looking for things. Yeah, I guess thinking about your earlier question about objects, because we didn't really talk about objects that's not really what landscape archaeologists deal with. Wasn't exactly your question, but it made me think about something that happened during the designing of the museum exhibit that you saw just a one photo of. It's still up in the Penn Museum if somebody wants to go and see it at YouTube Spy Planes and Aerial Archaeology. And it's an anthropology museum, right? So they're normally all about context and everything, but they wanted to treat the images that I prepared as objects, whereas I prepared them with all the interpretation, pointing out these proxies and how I wanted to use the exhibit to show the public how we interpret them, whereas the museum wanted to treat them as archival objects. And sort of leave them in their original state in the printouts. And so we eventually reached a compromise where I prepared these small things that went beside the actual photos, but it was this process of negotiation of treating those images as objects versus going through the archaeological process of interpreting and seeing these proxies and working out what those proxies are and what they say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So can you speak a little bit more to the second and first order proxies that you discussed in your talk?
Sure. This felt a little bit basic, but sometimes when you do things professionally, it doesn't occur to you what you're doing. But it was the prompt to think about proxies made me realize that a lot of my interpretations came from multiple steps. First, kind of seeing an image, interpreting the various signatures on it. That I'm calling first order, or first level, for lack of a better term. I'm happy to hear suggestions. And this is very basic. I think we all, everyone in this room is probably now so familiar with opening up a mapping app on your phone that you wouldn't have to be walked through. If you put on the satellite layer, everybody knows this. There was a time when I first started teaching before everybody had these apps on their phone, when I had to explain this, and now it's second nature. But thinking through clearly about what it is. Why is that a building? Oh, it's got shadows on the northwest, and this is a morning photograph. That means it's something that's standing up rather than it's something that's depressed, because then the shadows would be reversed if it was a depressed thing. I feel like I'm probably a better photo interpreter as a result of this. There's probably some CI guy in the back who's chuckling and says like that's the simplest thing he's ever heard. Of course, but it's the second order proxies that is really where the fun starts for us, where we get to take these vivid landscapes like hundreds of kites and try to say something meaningful about places in the past. I mean, this is what I would have called interpretation, I think, but I think the clarity of recognizing that I'm not actually looking at a social structure, an economy, but I am making a very distinct leap from something physical that I've interpreted from something on an image into an idea, an intensive economy, a powerful state that can mobilize labor. This is fun, and I think it makes me a slightly clearer thinker, I guess. Thank you, Bobby, for that.
Just to jump in briefly, I think that in terms of the first question about objects, one thing that I have definitely found through my field research for this book, in terms of speaking with both geophysicists and archaeologists, I've met people on, I'd say, both extremes and everywhere in between of the spectrum, where geophysicists who are absolutely convinced that archaeology can move to a kind of post-excavation state where you really don't need to dig holes anymore, and there is no object, there is no artifact, to archaeologists that are massively, massively suspicious of all geophysical surveys. And I've in the sort of the midpoints, they're very interesting arguments that I've seen play out between again, actually interpretation. About, if you have found something in the ground through radar or through magnetometry, how do you know that you have found it unless you open up the ground and look? And there are some examples, including things around Stonehenge, in fact, where very famous geophysicists have misinterpreted data that was later proven by excavation to have been a misunderstanding of what the data showed. And including also arguments between geophysicists, where some people have claimed to have found Roman auditoriums in Central Europe, or other very spectacular features resulting in grant money, only for other geophysicists to point out that in fact they're misinterpreting what was just basically a ground wave echo for the radar that had been misused or pushed across a field by someone that didn't know what they were doing. And so there's definitely a question of how do you know, it's an epistemological question and a question of interpretation. How do you know that you have found something simply because it shows up in an instrument? And it goes back to show that these aren't photographs. You're just getting data, and then you're interpreting the data, and then you're visualizing your interpretation, and you're creating something that reminds me of Lukasz's presentation of, what does it mean to take a photograph of a star, or what does it mean to take a photograph of a black hole? You're actually just taking data and visualizing it. It's not photography. And if you don't have the object, it just turns into this sort of interpretation game. And that's something that I think is quite interesting, at least as a journalist, seeing play out between archaeologists and geophysicists.
Ooh, I have a good example for you, Geoff.
Yeah.
We have a colleague who's digging a very large city in not so far where I work in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, who's done extensive magnetometry across the site and has described roads and neighborhoods, and a very, very large public building. Based on its scale and the layouts of the rooms that they can see, it's very clearly some sort of a temple. When he excavated it, he found nothing. There was nothing there. And he put a hole right where the shrine, like the central shrine, should have been. Now, this is an area where the ground surface has been very stable, and a kind of a soil has formed. This is this like geochemical process. It's completely homogenized the building material, which was mud brick, from the collapse of that building on itself. So it simply cannot be seen anymore because of this geophysical process by the human eye. But it can be seen by the magnetometry. And my colleague is very frustrated, and I keep saying to him, it actually doesn't, well, tell me if I'm wrong. It doesn't matter if you can't see the building. The magnetometer can see the building. What do you think? Does it exist? Does that building exist? I think you were just arguing that it does.
Well, to use a very similar example, one of the individuals who I've interviewed does extensive magnetometry surveys in Iraq, and at least in his telling, and then in my telling of his telling, there are examples that he has found where excavation literally does not work in the sense that you're excavating mud out of mud. What you're looking for is the magnetic charge that was basically baked into terracotta forms or pottery that was then thrown into the roadways or used for architectural purposes, that has left a magnetic signature but has otherwise left no sort of material signature. So if you dig into the ground, you'll find mud, 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 mud. So yeah, the question is the building there. I mean, I'm not the archaeologist, but I would say that we are constantly surrounded by images of things that we don't know if they're necessarily real. Astronomy is a really good example of that. There are distant astronomical objects and you can't see the cosmic microwave background radiation. You can't hear the cosmic microwave background radiation. But if you have a busted old television set or you have a radio telescope, then it's there. So for me, also just, the question then becomes, at what point does your skepticism kick in? I think it's easy to deny certain geophysical results and say that building is not there, especially if you excavate and you literally find an example that it isn't. But at what point then does one deny the existence of pulsars or deny the existence of quasars or of rare astronomical objects? That I feel like that's I guess it's an individual question about where your epistemological suspicion kicks in. And I guess for me, maybe I just want to believe, but I do think that it seems increasingly convincing to me when looking at the precision of magnetometry and of electrical resistivity and of ground penetrating radar, that the geophysicists aren't just doing a Scheherazade and kind of just like weaving tales to convince us of subterranean riches. But who knows? I might be wrong as well.
I really appreciated that both talks ended on a poetic note. I love that Jason and Emily did this idea that the collective impact of many people over a long time is actually enormous, right? And Geoff, the idea of the parable that you have of the mirror man there, I think would be kind of a reparative parable for us in our relationship to things that we lost. My urge is to push that a bit and think okay, so there's this kind of poetic point, but then using sort of the triangulation of images, of archival images, of collateral data, of Smithsonian maps. Does it, for you guys, does it end there as this offering of a poetic kind of possibility, or I'm kind of wondering what can we do with that, and I'm really kind of hopeful.
I had a slightly dark take on the Mirror Man. At least, not that, I mean, the Mirror Man story was great. The analogy of people kind of seeking archaeologists to be their mirror man, to help them kind of get that missing part of their body, which is their past, is really cool. And we archaeologists have to be extremely careful about that, because sometimes the past that they're seeking might be, my ancestors were here before your ancestors were here. And we can be quickly dragged into kind of geopolitical fights. So I work in a part of Iraq where the Kurds want to be there earlier than the Arabs, and the Arabs want to be there earlier than the Kurds, and the Jews and Palestinians are constantly fighting using DNA now to try to achieve, to have been the first person there. And I think I've done a pretty good job of staying out of this. I wish it were as easy as the Mirror Man to kind of come in and help. What I do try to do is give my local collaborators the data to, if they want to take those next steps. But it can be in certain areas, it can kind of be fraught to to deliver the past that people want. And sometimes it can be fraught to deliver the past that I think is the accurate one when it doesn't line up with maybe what people might wish it were for nationalistic purposes. Does that make sense, Geoff?
I would actually like to come back to the debate that you had about the structure that can be seen only through the magnetoscopic tools, because a good litmus test for this kind of I would say acceptance of the epistemology here, or the good litmus test for the skepticism that when does it kick in, would be search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and especially like the search for technosignatures in this sense. Like a technosignature is also defined as kind of some kind of artificial structure, and so I actually wonder also like in this respect like whether what kind of definition of artificial structure is actually used in archaeology? Like, where does your object start in this sense? Because that could also inform then when should the skepticism about like the temple existing or not existing, in the case that you discussed, like when should that kick in? So that would be one question. And the second is just about computational methods in archaeology. I'm just curious, like whether, in the spirit of the Carol Cleland's paper on historical and experimental sciences, like does archaeology also use some kind of like computational, I would say, acceleration of the timescales that would, for example, help you to infer what would be the possible traces that you can discover, for example, on some site?
I couldn't really hear.
Sorry, could you give like a quick version, but right into the microphone, because I couldn't quite hear.
Oh, I see. Okay. So I was talking about search for extraterrestrial intelligence and technosignatures. So what is, I would say, the definition of that there is a certain definition of artificial structure present there. And I was wondering, like, this is kind of like an extreme case of skepticism, also, like, in the sense that you, for example, talk about the temple, the example of the temple that you discussed, and the skepticism about whether the temple exists or doesn't exist. And I was saying that basically it would be like a good litmus test, epistemological litmus test, like to compare it with the definition of technosignatures and the skepticism of many astrobiologists about the extraterrestrial intelligence.
Okay, I think you've gone well beyond my expertise here. Tech, can you say something? Does technosignatures ring any bells with any of my panelists?
Well, I heard most of the question, the first, but the second half of it was about calculation and computation in archaeology.
Yes, and acceleration of time through history. Yeah.
Sure. And I mean, again, I'm obviously not an archaeologist, but I will say that it's been interesting interviewing geophysicists who are using very high-powered computational arrays to sort through radar data and magnetometric data. And to the point of actually revisiting data from earlier surveys that were made in the late 1990s, early 2000s, et cetera, and using their sort of computational magic to coax architectural forms out of white noise. But it's quite interesting. There's a very subtle theme of music today. Certain musical themes have come up, but watching certain individuals who I've interviewed go through the data in real time with me using software. It looks a lot like you might be doing sort of like an EQ on a stereo, where you're amping up contrast or you're shaving off certain things and you're making forms come out of it. But it also is interesting that as a lot of the geophysical tools are becoming larger scale, the data sets are so unbelievably huge that it's sort of and it's also a great way to get grant money. But you can get money for neural networks, machine learning, and AI to then go through your data and then look for architecture. So in a sense, this touches on the technosignature point you're raising, which is that how do you tell artificial intelligence what architecture is, especially if it's from 5,000 years ago and doesn't correspond to a Roman villa or doesn't correspond to modern housing or modern building. And you've got machine learning saying that it has found architecture in what would otherwise be white noise. You're getting into just epistemological questions on top of epistemological questions. But again, it is very fascinating to see that line of of where quote unquote archaeology starts turning into this weird form of data science and form projection through computation onto raw data.
Okay, Geoff, listening to your response here, I think I do have something to say about this. So I have been partnering with a computer vision professor to go through the white noise of every Landsat image of northern Iraq since 1972 and up into the Aster satellite as well. He is classifying every pixel of every band into a binary 0 or 1. Yes, I think it's a site, or no, I don't think it's a site. And he's doing this with from some control data that I give him based on some archaeological sites that I've identified. And it's a soil color thing in the case. These are mud brick archaeological sites that have melted. And the process is going to be wrong a lot. But given that each Aster image has 14 bands, and there are thousands of them, and it's so many zeros and ones that when he fuses them all together, what comes out is a probability. There's nothing is either 1 or 0, but he gives me a raster where the value of the pixel is somewhere between there, and that is the probability that pixel is an archaeological site. I have no idea how he does this because he's the computer vision guy and I'm the archaeologist. He doesn't actually care why that happens. All that he cares is that when I tell him that everything that I visited on the ground that had a probability of higher than 0.56 had artifacts on it, he considers that to be a success, and it's staggeringly accurate in that sense. But what is actually finding? He doesn't. I don't understand this. He doesn't care. All he cares is it successfully identifying the phenomenon that I've told him I want to identify. So I've struggled to get him to engage with this. I bought him pint after pint, saying explains to me, and he's like, I just don't care.
This to me seems like the ethical crux for all of us. Because you mentioned before archaeologists getting ground control, but I imagine that ground control, because I'm relating it to the process of making a building, is more related to the old kind of archaeology where you have the little stakes I'm sorry, I said little, but you have the stakes in the ground and then you have the string and then you have the digging that happens within that string, that it's a kind of planar closed polygon. And it seems like the shift is from ground control to control data. And I wonder, there's still the control there. And it seems like, I wonder about the future of these processes without resolving what you brought up with the marshes and the genocide at the marshes. Because we're all so interested in these military techniques and the instrumentality. But if we aren't also working with folks who are explaining to us all of how the collateral data also aligns with collateral damage, then that gap that you're talking about between you and that computer vision person, it seems to me will always reproduce the same collateral damage. So I love this question about the alien, because to me that's the way out. If we're not in the room of folks doing the work to explain the collateral genocides while we're doing this, then we have to then be figuring the alien as part of what's going on. Sorry, that could pretend that was a question.
Well, I will say that I've been contacted many, many times by people who worked on the Corona program and couldn't talk about it, and now they see that it's being used, and they get very excited. They love that their work is being acknowledged. I thank them for what they've done, and I don't have any interest in collaborating with them because I don't want to be perceived as being I'm using their collateral data, but I don't want to have anything to do with intelligence gathering.
So for example, the Martians. The training, I do have to say, if you look at what the Rockefeller Foundation funded in Cuba, with the military intervention in Cuba, draining the marshes is part of the malaria program.
Many places, yeah.
Yeah. But there's a history of that also being aligned not with just military funding, but also with different forms of slum clearance, so these kind of protocols where they slip in between fields, you know, like the field of urban planning, a field of public health, field of military genocide.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Saddam Hussein drains those marshes using plans that were drawn up by the British in the 1950s, you know, because the British had a mandate for Iraq in the interwar period, and then Iraq becomes independent, and those plans they never follow through on them, but they're sitting there, and they're drawn up for agricultural and modernization purposes.
But it's always oil extraction too, right?
No, they discover the oil later. So they don't drain the marshes I mean, they knew the oil was there.
Yeah, they knew it was there. I mean, even from the 1930s.
Yeah, but in the 1990s, but when they drew up the plans in the 1950s, they didn't know the oil was there.
I don't know. I had some drawings from 1930s that went through Iraq.
I'll say that I do make all of the images for the Kurdistan region. I make these available to. I mean, they're available to everybody. But what I do, the value that I add is I georeference them so they're scaled and they're positioned very accurately. And I leave these with my Kurdish colleagues. I'm quite happy for them to have this because this could be the basis for. Potential future legal action to reclaim land that was lost. It's not as much of a problem because in the Kurdistan region, the Kurds now have that as an autonomous region. In the case of the Marsh Arabs, I mean, that imagery could be potentially used to, make claims on the behalf of families, like this land used to be ours. This is where our village was. And look, here's this U2 image from 1968, and that's my parents' house, and that's my uncle's house, or something like that. I think that would be a great use of this, and it's because it exists digitally, and it even can be put up on the web as a web map that's accessible to the world. It would be a good use of these these intelligence images for kind of actions to maybe repair some of the damage from some of these genocidal actions.
Sorry to interject here. I do have to ask a very selfish question. I just started my studies here, my first year in landscape architecture, and I was curious, Geoff, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Very basic question. You started in architecture. Was that your background?
It wasn't really, actually. My background was a mix of art history and anthropology. And architecture came out of an interest or a realization that so many of my interests all could circle like a Venn diagram around architecture in the center. And so writing about architecture and researching architecture and the built environment in general became a driver for writing and teaching and collaborating with designers. Mm-hmm. And then that's what led to earlier books, and then the present book, which is looking at basically architecture in a kind of dematerialized state, quote unquote. When what does it mean to find the electromagnetic signature of a building as opposed to stepping into a building? What does that mean about architecture? What does it mean about how we represent ruins? And those sorts of questions.
I'm reading A Burglar's Guide to the City right now when I learned that I was going to be on this panel. And so I was just curious about how that trajectory of your career is charted and how you found yourself as a freelance writer, how that kind of, that followed from your studies.
Sure. I guess, just continuing on from that very briefly, I find that although being a freelance writer is very precarious, and you don't have access to Springer Link and you can't download millions of free PDFs, what's exciting about it is that you are able to pursue larger research projects as well as short sort of dopamine hits for individual articles or blog posts. And the book that you mentioned, A Burglar's Guide to the City, was similarly an attempt to look at the built environment through the lens of people trying to break into it. And so it allowed me to interview burglars and FBI agents and police and that kind of thing. And so now the fact that I get to meet archaeologists and geophysicists and go out in the field and see robots in Norway, mapping Viking settlements, I think it's exciting. I don't think that freelance journalism is for everyone. It's like I say, it's very precarious and you constantly have to come up with new ideas. But if that's your thing and you have fits of temporary enthusiasm and you want to pursue individual research projects that are outside your field, it's a good lifestyle.
How did you get in contact with the burglars?
Some of them got in touch with me through word of mouth because I had been in touch with people in the security industry and in certain communities like lockpicking communities. and some reached out to me. Other people I got in touch with because they were quote unquote reformed burglars, and had either given talks or had written about it. And then in some cases, law enforcement professionals put me in touch with people who they had actually investigated or put in jail.
We have time for one more question. Is there a question?
I'm just curious if you have anything to say about the kind of magnetic resonances of trash that is lying around. Like, do you kind of, because I guess you mentioned palimpsest as a, there's so many things that are overlaying each other, and also this possibility of using AI. There's this Japanese guy who is using AI to kind of find Nazca lines and things like that. So, like, where does this turn into some kind of hallucination of sorts?
I am actually a geophysicist. I have worked on southern Mesopotamian cities, mapping them via magnetic radiometry, and we have to remove all of the magnetic trash before, and also all the brush and everything before we survey, so that the data is not corrupted by the by trash. But yeah, that's it heavily shapes like where we can actually often image.
And does it correlate with actual physical trash that is there in like landfills and such?
Sometimes I worked on a site once that was an active landfill, but we couldn't do any geophysics there for that reason.
I would like to speak in favor of trash for reasons that Geoff just brought up. You remember he mentioned that sometimes the only way you find things through these geophysical surveys, you're not actually finding the walls. You're finding the garbage that people threw out into the fields, into the streets. The worst thing that ever happened to future archaeology was recycling and municipal trash collection. It's going to mean that there's going to be really good concentrations of data, but it's going to be spatially disconnected from the people that made it or used it, and it's going to be the contextless is going to be useless. So, Geoff, can you go on can your next book be like against garbage collection or something like that?
Sure, my wife will be thrilled. She's a big recycler. This isn't trash, but just one thing that I thought was interesting in terms of obstacles to archaeological work and or geophysical work that I found interesting was speaking to some geophysicists in the Bay Area who do a lot of work in the American West. And this is a very simple and stupid example, but I thought it was quite interesting that one of the banes of their existence is when park services, whether they're local, state, or federal, will try for either dust mitigation or for helping people park their cars without sinking into mud. Often they'll put down a chain link fence and then anchor it on the ground so that when you drive into a parking lot, you'll go into a parking pad that has chain link above dirt. But of course, if you have a chain link fence and you try to do a magnetometric survey or even radar, you'll have unbelievable amounts of interference, and you've effectively put a wall between current knowledge and what lies in the ground below. And so, I think it's just interesting that tiny little decisions like that have huge archaeological effects. But I also think it's quite interesting to imagine as a challenge in a design school to imagine, well, what is a geophysically transparent building regime? We have bird-safe windows. We have LEED sustainability. Well, what is an archaeologically sustainable building material palette? Is it possible to design something that is transparent to geophysical surveys and that would allow the past that still lies in the ground to be seen, and even with modern building material above it? It seems like an interesting challenge for future designers.
As a preservation guideline that you say.
What's interesting about that is that then that building can't itself be future proof.
Yeah.
But imagine designing an archaeologically invisible building. That's pretty cool. I think we're at stopping. And
I was, on the schedule it says concluding remarks. Ta-da! I mean, that was a buffer. That's in there as a buffer so that we could kind of finish on time. But anyway, I just want to thank first our last panel for, I think these were amazing presentations and amazing insights. And Mel, thank you so much for fostering the conversation. And of course, everyone in the previous two panels, and Susan for your wonderful keynote last night. As the person who convened this, I just feel like the conversation was rich, was robust, and dynamic throughout the day. I've certainly learned a lot, and just want to thank all of you for taking the time to come and join. I hope it was fruitful for all of you as well. And sort of moving on to post conference, we're gonna go have drinks and snacks over at Co-op. It's a small enough room. Anyone who's in the room who wants to come can come. I'm not paying, but I'll be there drinking. So if we want to continue the conversation, I hope you'll all join me. But thank you again to everyone. I think it was a really fantastic time.